My name is John Kenyon. I'm the director of the City of Literature organization. I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Iowa City Book Festival. I would first like to start by thanking our sponsors who make our programming possible. We have the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa City Public Library, our hosts today, Prairie Lights Books, Iowa Public Radio, the Graduate Hotel, and Think Iowa City, who've all helped to make this possible. So thanks to them. And between events, you can visit the book fair going on at Merge, which is just up around the corner on Dubuque Street. The book fair features many different publishers and some literary organizations from the area who share about what they're doing, and the publishers sharing some of their work. Don's publisher with Ice Cube Press is up there. We'll be down here later selling his books. Did want to share that the vast majority of book festival events, while they are offered without charge, are not always free to put on, and so your financial support helps to be able to make this possible. We have made it incredibly easy for you if you pick up one of your print programs. On the back, we have a QR code that you could use to donate or to visit iowcitybookfestival.org and click on support. So with those shameless plugs out of the way, I will now introduce our panelists. We are here today from Don McLeese. Before joining the journalism faculty at the University of Iowa, Don was an award-winning music journalist. He was popular music critic at the Chicago Sun-Times and the Austin American-Statesman, and senior editor at No Depression magazine, as well as a frequent contributor to Rolling Stone. His work has appeared in publications including the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, the Oxford American, and Entertainment Weekly. He's written 3 previous books, including Dwight Yoakam, 1,000 Miles from Nowhere. Today, he will discuss his new book, Slippery Steps, Rolling and Tumbling Towards Sobriety. And today, he is joined by Kyle Munson. I'm sure Don and I started reading Kyle when he was the music critic for the Des Moines Register, but he gained his true statewide acclaim as only the 4th statewide Iowa columnist since World War II. There, he won several awards, and I won't go into all of them. You could elaborate later, Kyle, if you'd like. Since 2018, he's worked in financial services as part of the in-house studio with Principal in Des Moines to help produce an ambitious range of content marketing for the firm's diverse array of global audiences. And you can tell who wrote that. No. So please help me welcome Don and Kyle.
Well, hey, yeah, thanks for joining us both here in the room in Iowa City and online. Don, I'm just honored to be here with you to celebrate the release of this book, Slippery Steps, Rolling and Tumbling Towards Sobriety. So we're going to have a conversation, and please stick around. You'll have time to ask questions both in person, and if you're online, you can start asking questions anytime you want, and we'll get to those a little bit later during this. And of course, a chance for people to purchase
Although
books.
we have no online apparatus, so we won't see any of those questions, but you can feel free to ask any questions you want.
They'll be carefully curated and fed to us later on during the session. Well, like I said, this is a great opportunity. So Don and I have not discussed the book. Of course, I read the book, and I even prepared a bunch of questions. We share a lot of media DNA, as I say, being rock critics and columnists, and you owned a record store. I once worked at a CD shop. Anyway, so music, retail, and journalism. Before we get into like the heart and soul of this very deeply personal book, I wanted to point out that it does expose your personal shame, and by that I mean you reveal that the first musician you ever loved was Perry Como. So, and
I remain proud of that. I will take Perry, and I told Perry Como that, and he was so nice about it. So, and I've met a lot of rock musicians who are not nice, not nearly as nice as Perry Como. So.
All right, so you stand by that. Well, that's good. And so this is, you state more than once in this book, this is not it's an autobiography in a sense, but it's not about your life and career as such. So you mentioned I remember there's a vivid scene you paint in one part of the book of being backstage with the Rolling Stones, I think, and there's maybe a mountain of cocaine on the piano, something like that. But there aren't those kinds of stories in this book. This is your journey towards sobriety. And I want to get into that a little bit more, but first of all, hanging out with the Rolling Stones, apparently you're on Keith Richards' Christmas card list. Is there some other just memory from all your years of covering these musicians that comes to mind that didn't make it into this book what the other book that you have to write someday?
I wrote so much of that book so long ago that I honestly can't remember everything that's in there and not. I did once share a very potent and seemingly religious marijuana experience with members of Jimmy Cliff's band. Not Jimmy Cliff because he's a Muslim and was not, but yes, I once had to drive home from Park West in Chicago, and it was the kind of youthful thing that I would do in my, I'm amazed that I'm alive sometimes, but my only other, I've got, I could tell war stories. Bob Dylan has a very soft handshake. It's the deadest of dead fish handshakes. And it may have been just part of his, I think he's got arthritis at this point, which is why he doesn't play as much guitar as he used to live. But yes, it was striking how soft his handshake was.
Wow.
That's my rock and roll glamour. That's all of it. The rest of it was just meeting deadlines.
Religious experiences and soft handshakes. Well, that's for the book to come. So for this book, though, I was curious, how did the structure, well, first of all, before we get to the structure of the book and the story and the narrative, what kind of bargain did you strike with yourself in terms of what you were going to put into this? Because this is such a deeply personal story. How did you navigate that with yourself and with all the people in your life, family, friends, that kind of a thing?
Well, my initial idea was that I wanted to write the book that I wanted to write, and that I would get out of it from that, just having that kind of a cathartic experience, kind of coming to terms with all this and moving on. And so that involved not only not worrying about anybody else who was reading it, not what they might say, but also not worrying about how anybody might market it, because it does fall in between. It's kind of a recovery book, but not a real preachy one. It's kind of a memoir, but I have no illusions that anybody would want to read about me just because of me. So I think it could be a helpful book to some people. There was only one person who I felt that I had to be negotiating things with, and she often didn't want to be reading it. So there was some negotiation back and forth. But yeah, if one writes a book all the time thinking, well, what's this person going to think of it? What's this person going to think of it? It's not going to be a very good book. It certainly isn't going to be a very honest book. I do think that the only person who's really embarrassed within the pages of this book is me. That I'm the fall guy in this book. I'm the chump. I think that my wife sitting there with that handsome gentleman next to her that she is the hero of the book. Her perspective is not necessarily mine, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
This is the most personal thing you've ever written, I would assume.
This is the most personal thing that anybody has.
So was it made, did it take you a while to make yourself comfortable with that through the process of writing it, or were you just were you prepared by all your years in journalism and or your years in Alcoholics Anonymous in part to get to this draft?
Probably more from my years in Alcoholics Anonymous than from my years in journalism. I have not spent my career writing about myself. And again, the major way I was able to get through this was by not imagining anybody reading it. I was writing it for myself. and it developed some narrative momentum and just momentum in terms of getting the work done, because I was thinking about things that I hadn't thought about in decades, revisiting parts of my life that I had, just probably not even remembered at all. It's like you start remembering things, and memories lead to more memories, and you start putting together, how this dot connects to that dot. I think I went into the project thinking that I had lived 3 or 4 different lives, and that the person leading those lives really didn't have much of a common denominator. And over the course of writing the book, I think I started to see what the thread was from there to here, how I got it, as best as I could tell from this incarnation to that incarnation. I also think it's deeply part of the alcoholism and recovery process, because one of the reasons, and there's so many reasons why people drink, one of them is that it's fun, and it tastes good and all that, but one of the reasons that, the self-medicating part is that it numbs you, that it keeps you from experiencing emotions or memories or whatever that you might find uncomfortable. And so a big part of recovery is learning to live what they call life on life's terms, and instead of running away from that discomfort, maybe embracing it would be too strong of a word, but at least recognizing it, working your way through it, recognizing that, that this is, that you can come to terms with this. So yeah, I mean, it's, it wasn't that I was feeling like, oh, I'm revealing these horrible truths, because I wasn't revealing anything to anybody but me. I was the only one writing it, or reading it for years. Excuse me. And then by the time it had actually been through a few drafts and, talking about publication and stuff like that, I kept coming back to it and realizing I really like this. And that is not always the way with book projects, and it's not always the way, I realize someone like you, superbly self-confident, who has never made a misstep, would not experience that. But, sometimes you're in the middle of something and you say, this is crap. Why did I think anybody would be interested?
I've been there on a lot of deadlines.
And what I would do, I'm still big on compartmentalizing. When I'm in the middle of the school year, I could not be doing, manuscript revision at night or whatever. So I'd always come back to it in the summer. And when I'd come back to it in the summer, I'd think, hey, pretty good. That's pretty good. This does deserve to get out in the world.
Like any good titles, Slippery Steps has layers of meaning.
Yes.
And so the structure of the story, that you bring the reader into, I think, your crisis point, essentially, which, involves steps. And how did that, you mentioned all the revisions, working summer after summer. How easy was it to structure the narrative, and how are you going to pull people through this journey, which includes, kind of the crisis up front, and then you deliberately go through all 12 steps of the program in the back. So how was that draft number 12, or how did
that was draft number 1. But I will say that Slippery Steps was a maybe draft number 12 title. This book was proposed and initially sent out under the title The High Bottom Drunk, which I loved that title, but it was kind of inside baseball. People wouldn't necessarily know what I was talking about. But most importantly, when I applied for my Career Development Award, what the rest of the world calls a sabbatical, I was told that I was informally told that, yes, you've got a chance of doing this, but they're not going to let that go with that title. They're not going to okay, The High Bottom Drunk is something that we're giving you 6 months off to write. So at that point, I changed it to something that I knew was not going to be the title, and from then on in, went through dozens of titles in my head till we got to Slippery Steps. The reason it's organized the way it is, and this comes from my professional training, a chronological narrative is generally pretty easy to follow, but you cannot start a book like this at the beginning because nobody cares what I was like as a baby. We would have to go decades to get to anything that was interesting to anybody but me. But if I start the book with what is probably the most dramatic part of the book, kind of a climactic before and after. If I start right there, then I am hoping that I am hooking the reader's attention and that the reader will then follow, allow me to circle back to the backstory, which is kind of important to the story, and then bring it all the way back up, to the present day. So the structure was really, it was from professional training. The kind of the part that I had to negotiate, and it took a few times, and I actually took a couple outside readings by people who were, just because it was far enough along that I could show it to people who weren't intimately involved in the story, but who I would respect as stylists. And both of them said up front, I was worried about getting into my life too quickly, that it would be switching from what might be the more common connection, falling apart, getting into recovery, what's that like? And what I was hearing back was too much AA too early. We don't care about AA. We'd rather learn more about you or whatever. So there were a couple chapters that are now in the latter part of the book that were previously in an earlier part of the book. Before I knew the second part was going to have to be, he was born, blah blah blah. But then I just had to figure out how much in advance before I get to the memoir part, the life part.
There's one passage in here that delves into how you became a writer in the first place, because you had your early life and academic career, and you owned this record store, but you gradually got into journalism and to really finding writing as a discipline. And I love, and being somebody whose life has been filled with so much music, and you think about the rhythm of that and the rhythm of writing, I didn't realize you got into writing by running. And so I love this passage here where you had quit smoking cigarettes, I think, too. Yeah. And so you wanted to go out and you wanted to run. And so this new guy who didn't smoke would need new habits to reinforce this decision. I quit going to bars, even to hear music for a while, because bars where I smoked more and everyone else did. So you saved the money that you would have spent on cigarettes, a couple cartons a week, and you ate ice cream. But then you started running and jogging. And so running for a half hour or so each morning, around 3 miles, became a kind of meditation for me. Before I had ever experimented with meditation, I would find my mind clearing, and I would be thinking about nothing at all, not even about running, on the prairie path that ran through the woods near my home and away from any traffic. And so what happens is but I found that a half hour was about the right span for 3 or 4 paragraphs to compose themselves in my head. And that once I got done running, I could type them out, not writing so much as transcribing. And then the next morning, I could reread what I had written the previous day, revise, and then run again and add another 3 or 4 graphs. I mean, I was fascinated by how through the rhythm of that's how you became a writer. And that tracks with my own experience. You take a walk, and so many times you're able to kind of solve something, but that was the genesis for you in terms of writing.
It was. And yeah, a lot of things happened, and that's even one of the instances where, it seemed like to me I became a different person. I became a person who had been smoking upwards of 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Well, I couldn't afford that now on a professor's salary. And closing the bars and all that, and to somebody who was doing things for my health. And I'd had a similar experience earlier in college where I had a summer job delivering mail. And delivering mail seemed like such a great life to me. Just if I didn't really have to think about it at all, I thought, well, this is wonderful, just walking from place to place. And that was kind of like what running was like. Delivering mail in the winter probably wouldn't have been nearly as meditative, but I did end up running through winters. I'm pretty obsessive. Once I get on a routine, that routine it sticks. Oh, yeah. Pardon me. Until the next routine replaces it.
Yeah. Another thing reading this book, and as you said, kind of talking about your personal mind frame and life leading up to AA. When we met decades ago, I never would have guessed how awkward you felt in social situations. And you explain in the book how here you were in a very public career as a journalist, interviewing famous musicians, being a public voice, all this kind of a thing, and interviewing all these people. But you always saw it as here was you didn't feel awkward in those situations because you felt that you were a conduit basically there. Mm-hmm. And so it was just interesting to see the way you framed your personal psychology of feeling a certain way that maybe contributed to all the traits that led up to you drinking more, but yet operating in these very public situations and with these very famous people. So there's a little divide there, I guess.
Oh, there's so many divides, if you want to start seeing me for therapy a couple times a week, but I'm a pathologically shy person. I'm a person who is very uncomfortable in the presence of others, particularly others I don't know, and I have subsequently made my career talking to strangers in interviews and talking to strangers in the classroom. They don't remain strangers, but, and in both cases, I am able to see, it isn't like they're talking to me or that I'm having to connect with them. In the case, it was 500,000 readers of the Chicago Sun-Times that these people were talking to. I was just the conduit. Now I'm the educational conduit. But yes, I was and am very uncomfortable being around other people. So if y'all would kind of step out there and we could Zoom the rest of this, yeah.
The online audience is ideal for you.
Exactly, yes. I was social distance before social distance was cool.
So you also talk a little bit about, deeply personal project. A lot of daily newspaper journalism, music journalism, column writing, but you also had a period in your career working at a national magazine, when you moved to Iowa and to Des Moines. And it's funny, you talk about that period of your writing where it was, you didn't have as individual of a voice as you're exhibiting here, and you talk about the editorial process being more like every editor was making territorial markings on your prose.
Right.
So that would be maybe the opposite and least favorite version of how you like to write versus the path to this book?
Well, it was a different experience, and right then I was ready for it. I had my column taken away, my award-winning column taken away in Austin, Texas, by an editor who, I thought it was my job to report on people in power and to be kind of a watchdog. He liked courting the people in power. And when my column, it's a long story. But, I could have stayed in Austin. It was very immature. They gave me great play as a feature writer. They paid me very well. I took a significant pay cut to come, first to Midwest Living and then to the University of Iowa. But I just, you you've hurt my feelings, and I'm going to quit, and I'm going to take my ball and go home. It was, it was kind of that sort of thing. When I got to Midwest Living, a Meredith publication, part of it was that I had been making my living by sharing my opinions for decades. And I was getting kind of sick of being the opinion spouter, of having to kind of generate these opinions that would fill space 3-4 times a week. So the idea of adding editor to my list of skills and, kind of going, instead of the creativity going to the, measure twice, saw once, that sort of thing. It seemed like it would be a nice change of pace. It was a nice change of pace. The first day Maria came in to pick me up, she looked at all the people that I was, I wasn't a kid when I went there, but I was 50 years old and part of a youth movement, because they wanted to get a little younger in the, and all of the people who were around my age, they seemed like my parents, it was just a whole different thing than where I was coming from. But I got to go on great trips. I got it was fun, but after 3 years, the thing is, it's only in retrospect we understand how things come together and what leads to what. Because if I had not left Austin, gone to Des Moines, and later been followed to Iowa by my dear friends Frank and Gigi Durham, I never would have, come over to this campus, as a guest in a class, learning that they had one of the rare tenure track jobs that did not require a PhD, that it was more of a professional type job, and that I could come full circle to the academic aspirations I'd had when I was in grad school. So on the one hand, being at Meredith might not have worked out very well. On the other hand, going to Des Moines is what has given me this job, which is the best job of my life, for the last 20 years. So it's funny how things have a tendency to work out. The other funny thing about the way that worked out is I think at least part of the reason they hired me is because they wanted to have some sort of campus connection to Meredith, because Meredith was the biggest media company in the state and probably the biggest multimedia company between the two coasts. Little realizing that in some ways I was the anti-Meredith guy. I could bring Meredith guests. I could bring Meredith guests over. I could take school groups on professional trips. I could arrange that sort of stuff. But as far as trying to open a pipeline to Meredith in the same way that Drake had, because they've got the Meredith Journalism Building, and the way that Iowa State had, I would be telling my students, flee, go in the other direction. That isn't where you want to be. You want, maybe that's a good place for you to land when you're old and just looking for stability.
Yeah.
So things work out.
Well, on the theme of things working out, there's a lot of beautiful language in this book, and
thank you. It's all in English.
there's one line. You were obviously your life was transformed by AA and meditation, everything that you describe in here. But you also explain child of the '60s, very much a self-styled rebel, not very religious, that sort of a thing. But you talk about this whole concept of a power greater than yourself coming through AA. It really hits you. And there's a phrase that I can't get out of my mind where you say, and AA gives you the latitude to perceive this however you'd prefer. There is a spiritual dimension to life, something within our existence beyond meat, blood, and synapses. I love that, meat, blood, and synapses. But so you've kind of reconciled that you feel this transformation even though you can't define it, and it's obviously come to greatly define your life.
It has, and I don't, it's not a preachy book. I'm not trying to tell anybody what to believe or if to believe or whatever. Whatever I have experienced through this recovery process, I think is something that transcends words. I do believe that during a lot of my increasing amount of alcohol use, I was trying to fill a pretty deep hole in myself. There's kind of this emptiness, and whether one wants to call it spiritual emptiness or what, there's this feeling that whatever you are just isn't enough, and you're trying to fill this up. And it was only after I stopped drinking that I recognized that in trying to fill up that hole, I was merely digging a deeper hole. I was making that emptiness larger. I don't have any religious epiphanies to share with anyone because I'm not a religious person. I do think that, that different things in my life have led to some sort of connection, resolution, or whatever in ways that I could have never anticipated. I think my life, I have become less concerned with life working out the way I think it should. I have been increasingly more likely to just trust that things will work out, that they may work out the way I think I want them to. They may work out in a way that is better than I thought I wanted them to. And I can't tell you whether that's a spiritual dimension, whether whether that's fate, whether that's serendipity, whether it's just that however things work out, one makes the best of it, whether it's feeling connected to other people and recognizing that, I am just a small part of something much bigger, of feeling more of a spiritual kinship, also of having, a meditation practice that really started when I was drinking, but that has always been kind of a foundational center of my life, and has proven it's another one of my obsessive rituals, and it grounds my life. I don't know whether that's evidence of something. I do know that, one of the things that appeals to me about AA is you can approach it in many different ways, but, and some people are very Christian about it. Some of the people who've gotten the most out of AA that I know are either agnostics or atheists. You don't have to drink any particular Kool-Aid. But I do know that things are better when I am not trying to grip the wheel that hard and to determine how everything should go and what's going to happen next month or next year or whatever. I don't believe in any sort of creation myth. I don't have to believe in any sort of afterlife. So in terms of conventional religion, I don't have much conventional religion. But I do have more of a sense that there is a whole lot more to life than just me. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
Oh, yeah, no.
It makes more sense in the book.
Makes sense.
That's one of the reasons that I write. It's harder for me to do this sort of stuff extemporaneously without constant revision.
Well, it was something I loved you said earlier in the session this morning, talking about rock journalism and rock criticism, is you write about things to fully understand and process them. That's part of writing, is just how you understand yourself
I do,
and the world.
yeah, and I have colleagues who think that's crazy. I have colleagues and had journalistic colleagues who knew exactly what the story was, perhaps even before they went out to report the story. And they knew they needed this quote to fit here, so they'd get that particular quote to fit there. They'd get, I don't know what the story is until I'm in the middle of writing it. I cast a wide net, and I tape my interviews. And, things that I would have forgotten that somebody said pop out at me during the transcription process. And sometimes I don't even those seem like throwaway lines. And then when I'm in the process of writing, always in the morning, generally first thought, best thought, I discover that is the key to my story. That there I found it.
Yeah, well put. Well, whether you're with us here in Iowa City or you're online, we'll have some questions here in just a minute. And Don, let me know if you want to read any segment, any piece from the book.
No, I'd like Maria to come up and read.
Well, I did want to ask, one thing I had is still in mind was, and Maria, feel free to come up and do a dramatic reading on any part of the book. So you've obviously had a whole career of journalism, and you've written previous books, including one on Dwight Yoakam. Mm-hmm. But now after doing a book that is so much about how it was difficult to know even yourself, does that put your entire history of journalism into question? What I mean is...
No, it puts the entirety of human consciousness into question. You cannot believe anything. You cannot be sure of anything. We may not even be in this room together.
Okay,
so
all right.
Proceed.
Don't go down that rabbit hole you're saying. That's right.
No, we always know that whatever I tell my students, even when it is not a first-person story, even when it's not about you, it's your story. You're the one that decided that this was an important subject. You're the one that decides it starts here and it ends there. You're the one who decides how to focus it. You're the one who decides how to frame it. Somebody else could write an entirely different story based on this person, based on these facts. But yeah, so we're all somewhat subjective. We all have our own ideas about how to make this work. I believe in, as we talked about before, transparency. I try to be transparent in what I am trying to achieve and how this best serves the reader. And so I think there's value to what I do and what any of us do, even though none of us is the last objective word.
Well put. All right. Well, so we'll practice some transparency right here and let the public ask questions. So if there's anybody in the room that would have any questions for Don, I see we have a couple of folks here. This gentleman back here.
And we actually did get a question from online, so after we get
All
this
right.
one.
Excellent.
I have a correction and a question. We were here first.
What? You were in Iowa City first. I was in Iowa first.
That's right. Okay, good. Just so you and I lobbied hard for you. So I'm glad you're here. In my experience with 12-step programs, sometimes it's open mic night. and I wonder if you have the sense of having put the genie back in the bottle by telling stories in the form of a book that is now on record. And if there's a relationship between your writing and your in-person experience with groups that are there for a kind of therapy.
It's definitely a kind of therapy. I wrote this. I wrote this for me. I didn't care whether anybody else read it. I didn't care whether anybody bought it. I didn't. Once I was done, that was it. I'd gotten what I want out of it, and I do, and this is also something that's part of the recovery experience. I have felt lighter in recovery. I have felt that I'm no longer as much a prison of all my calculation of, how much drinking is too much drinking, how much do I need to hide, in order to have it seem acceptable, this, that, and the other thing. And there's a similar process that goes along when one is writing this sort of thing, because it's definitely clearing the air, opening, turning the light on in the closet, exhaling, whatever sort of metaphor you want to use for it. But it's this feeling that perhaps there has been something back there, and it isn't back there anymore. It's out there.
Another question.
This is totally not fair, obviously, because I know your book inside out. But I think that I was wondering if you could talk about it's a two-part question. One is that you were
No, you're only
immersed.
allowed one part.
Okay,
This
I'm going
is
to do
one question per customer.
1A, question 1A. Anyway, I was wondering about the ties between drinking and music. You're immersed in the music world, and when I think of that, I think of people drinking. And then also, I'd just like to hear about Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones in general.
Hear about what?
Oh, I'd also
Richards
just
and the
like to hear
Rolling
about Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones.
Okay,
in
well,
general.
I will address the first part first. I was a teenager. I was 16 years old in 1966, which was absolutely the best time ever before or since to be 16 years old, because you had all this rebellious music that was scaring your parents to death. And you had the start of the psychedelics, marijuana, everything else, all of it playing into this very rebellious stereotype of what you never wanted to be. And I never wanted to be my parents. I didn't want any of that. So this emerging rock culture presented me with a manifesto that I could embrace. And part of that manifesto is, too much ain't enough. Walk on the wild side, all that. I was a young, impressionable youth. Now I am an old, impressionable adolescent, and I still, find all of that very attractive. But I no longer feel that, I mean, there was a lot. It was great to be getting away with stuff that was illegal. You're drinking underage. You're smoking illegal drugs. You were having sex before you were supposed. All of this stuff. This was being bad, and it was great to be bad. That was the rock and roll ethos. Was the greatness of being bad. I was very impressionable. At that time of my life, and ultimately I jumped from rock and roll into journalism, always thinking of myself as a rock person who happened to end up in journalism rather than a journalist who happened to be covering rock. And journalism was, again, perfect for me because journalism romanticized work hard, play hard more than any other field. It was like, you're going to bust your ass until deadline, and then you're going to go down to the bar to drink off the deadline pressure. And so there was a lot of that. Keith Richards, the first night I ever met Keith Richards, the Rolling Stones were using Chicago as a base. This must have been 1978, maybe. And so staying in Chicago, flying out to area dates, that's where I went to SIR, which is the instrumental rental rehearsal space, where I saw the mountain of cocaine on the piano, and I was told by the publicist who had arranged all this, "You're not going to write about this, of course." And of course I didn't, because that would have closed off that connection at that time. My readers didn't need to know that at the expense of my job. So while they were in there, I had to do an entire. We were going to do a special section. The Chicago Sun-Times was going to do like 20 pages on the Rolling Stones, including interviews with each of them. And so my interview with Keith and Keith, when I had met him over the pile of cocaine, it was almost like, it was like subhuman. It was like this grunting at me. And so we arranged the interview with Keith. I'm already scared to death. He had been an idol. I don't like dealing with strangers anyway, and this was a very intimidating person. I was told to clear my evening, that they would get in touch with me when Keith was up and ready to do the interview. I was to start being ready at like 8 o'clock at night. That might have been around the time that Keith might get up. So 8 o'clock, nothing from Keith. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Finally, it was around midnight. I got the call. Keith is just getting ready. Why don't you come by the hotel in an hour and a half? and again, I am petrified by all of this, and worried about what to talk with him about. And he ended up being just one of the more charming and erudite interviewees I've ever had, because he really knew and cared a lot about music. And so we had some common frames of reference, that it wasn't going to be just the same old Keith story, that we could get into some stuff, that we could get into Chicago blues and reggae and stuff that I knew perhaps not as much as he did, but cared as much as he did. So we ended up talking for 4 hours. I mean, and that's a long time. It was well after sunrise by the time I got done with that, and he was great. He's a sweetheart.
And we had an online question, you said?
Yeah, we're going to take a question from online. It says, journalists get feedback on stories about other people, but this is your story in your life. Were you sensitive about taking feedback about this book, and what advice would you give to a writer who doesn't want their darlings to die?
Well, your darlings to die is an old editing adage that whatever you are most proud of in the piece is probably overwritten and may well stick out, probably destroys the flow. I take each darling on an independent basis, and I negotiate fiercely with editors, because I sometimes, I come from the prima donna school of writing that I wrote it that way because that's the way I want it.
Prancing like Mick Jagger. Right?
Yeah, if I wanted it a different way, that's the way I would have written it. But you have to decide which battles are worth fighting. You have to decide, does it stick out? Does it hurt the flow of the piece? Does it draw too much attention to itself? I am much better these days than I ever, and it actually took being in academics and teaching editing and teaching the collaborative nature of journalism that I had to become more comfortable with all that myself. And everything else that I teach about writing, I have to start adhering to it, because if I'm expecting other people to. As far as feedback goes, all of the feedback I got pre-publication was helpful feedback, and it was feedback that I solicited, and there was very little of it because, again, I wanted to write the book I wanted to write. I didn't want to be worried about who's the target audience, is this memoir or recovery, this, that, or the other thing. But now that it's out in the world, no, I'm fine. I as a critic, I come from the as long as they spell your name right school of criticism. I'm fine with any. I'm thankful for anybody who reads it, whether they like it or not. I'm willing to engage in dialogue with anybody who wants to engage in dialogue, and I'm putting myself out there just like the people who I have reviewed have put themselves out there. So it's another thing I've taught is that journalism is a contact sport. If we're not, when we're doing journalism, we're not playing touch football. We may land some blows. We may hurt some feelings. And it's unfair for me to have made my living doing that for decades and not expect the same in return. So anybody who's gunning for me, I'm ready.
That exchange reminded me of a book by the great writing coach Roy Peter Clark. He has one called Murder Your Darlings.
Yeah.
Well, I know that we have to, speaking of the book, and Ice Cube Press, they're here to sell some of your books. We have to leave some time for that, but I want to check to see if there's any more questions. Yeah.
We can do one last one, and then we can sell some books.
All right.
I'd actually rather take questions and screw the books.
I was just wondering if maybe if there are other memoirs that you possibly took inspiration from, maybe David Carr's Under the Gun or Augustine's Confessions?
Well, David Carr's is a great, great book, and David actually, and he spoke to my arts and entertainment journalism class the last time he was on campus before his unfortunate death. I'd say that Mary Carr's trilogy of books, and particularly since those came out when I was in Texas and identified so much with that sort of Texas honesty, that hers really hit me deeply. Tobias Wolff's books and the way, and even his fiction occasionally draws very heavily, from his life. Most of what I got from recovery memoirs was a sense of how I could write a book that might have a different purpose. Because pretty much every recovery memoir that I had ever read, it was like this person's life had collapsed. They had lost their job, they'd lost their health, they'd lost their money. They were crawling on cut glass through hell, and then somehow through the miracle of something, they pulled their life back together, at least together enough to write the book. My case was not nearly that bad. I'd never lost a job. I'd never missed a day of work. I've never blown an assignment. Most of the people who are dear friends of mine, do not think to this day that I ever showed any symptoms of having a drinking problem. I was pretty good at compartmentalizing. And my hope is that, and I'm not trying to tell anybody to do anything. I don't care what, all my friends drink. It's fine. They can drink. I'm an all or nothing person. For me, it is much better not to drink at all than to try to be moderate and count drinks or whatever. That would make me miserable. But if there are other people who are kind of in the sober, curious mode, the feeling, well, things haven't gotten that bad, maybe I don't have a drinking problem. And I'm not trying to tell them they do, but what I'm trying to say in the book, I guess I'm taking a long way around to say this, is that your life might become better in ways that you had never anticipated. That it isn't so much that you are giving up drinking and condemning yourself to a life of renunciation and asceticism or whatever. It's that you may discover dimensions and richness in life that you had no reason to expect. I wasn't admitting that I was an alcoholic or anything, but going into AA, I wanted to save my marriage. I think Maria and I both thought that this was going to be a passing phase, and that, after a month or so, maybe we'd both figure out, how much I could drink and resume some semblance of my normal life. What I discovered through Alcoholics Anonymous was that I preferred this other life, that day after day I was becoming happier without drinking than I had, during all the decades where drinking was at the center of my life. And so if there's other people who are having that sort of calculation, am I drinking too much? Do I have a problem? The quick glib answer is, if you're thinking you have a problem, you probably have a problem. People who don't have a problem don't really think about this stuff too much. They take it or leave it. People who obsess about it, something is trying to tell them something. But I'm not trying to tell anybody how to live their life. I'm just trying to provide an example that things happened to me that I wasn't anticipating. And it's almost like, if you're thinking about it, come on in, the water's fine, It's that sort of book.
Well, hey, thanks to everybody here in Iowa City for joining us and for joining us online. Stick around to buy books and have Don sign them, or also, please go online to buy them. Don, congrats on this book.
Thank you. And thank you, Kyle. believe me, this was a lot better for me and a lot better for you than if I just sat up here and read and took questions. It would have been a nervous wreck. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Kyle, for doing such a terrific job.
Oh, thanks. It was a fun conversation.